Before the infamous Black Death of the 14th century decimated Europe, long before images of plague doctors and mass graves became cultural symbols of doom, there was another plague. One that arrived silently, almost invisibly, and yet it shook the foundation of the known world. A plague so devastating that it killed millions, brought empires to their knees, and darkened the skies over Europe for over 2 centuries, and yet most people today have never even heard of it. This is not the story you were taught in school, because history, as it's passed down, often remembers what it can paint, what it can dramatize, what it can romanticize. The Black Death, with its grotesque imagery and vivid European records, made for a memorable horror. But what about the one that came before, the plague that ravaged the Eastern Roman Empire, the so-called Byzantine Empire, during the 6th century? The one that spread faster than anything seen before, killing up to half the population of the Mediterranean world. The one that almost erased Constantinople from the map. That plague had a name, the Plague of Justinian. We begin in the year 541 CE, in a time when Europe was already in pieces. The great Roman Empire was no more. The western half had collapsed into barbarian kingdoms. In the east, the Byzantine Empire, ruled by Emperor Justinian I, tried to hold the old dream of Rome together. His vision was one of restoration, reconquering lost territories, building colossal cathedrals, reviving the legal and cultural glory of the empire. But just as his ambitions reached their height, just as the dome of Hagia Sophia crowned the skyline of Constantinople, death arrived in the grain ships. From the harbors of Egypt to the narrow alleys of the capital, the pestilence crept in like a shadow. At first it was whispers, a merchant who collapsed in the Forum, a servant who died overnight. Then it became impossible to ignore. Corpses littered the streets, fires burned without mourners, priests chanted alone, surrounded by the dead. Constantinople, the jewel of the empire, was turning into a mausoleum. And yet, unlike the Black Death, the plague of Justinian left behind no famous paintings, no iconic images, no literary masterpieces. Only fragments, only silence, and perhaps that silence is even more terrifying. The year was 541 CE. The first whispers of sickness emerged not from the heart of the empire, but from the edges in the Egyptian port city of Pelusium, a bustling hub where the Nile met the Mediterranean. Traders came here from Arabia, India, even as far as China. The docks teemed with life, spices, ivory, papyrus, and most importantly, grain. But the grain ships from Egypt carried more than food. Hidden in the holds in sacks of wheat were stowaways, black rats, and upon them, the real killers, fleas infected with Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes bubonic plague. From Pelusium, the disease began to spread like a rumor you couldn't unhear. Within weeks, Alexandria, the intellectual heart of Egypt, was overwhelmed. And then it sailed north, following the same trade routes that had enriched the empire for centuries. Cities that had once been symbols of civilization became petri dishes of death. Antioch, Jerusalem, Athens, and finally Constantinople. At the time, Constantinople was the largest city in Europe. Over 500,000 people lived behind its famed Theodosian walls. It was a metropolis of marble forums, domed churches, and bathhouses. But all of it depended on the movement of goods, the circulation of ships, the very veins through which the plague now pulsed. As spring gave way to summer, the city's rhythms broke. Carts that once carried olive oil now transported bodies. Wells ran dry, not from lack of water, but from fear of contamination. The air was thick with the scent of incense and rot. And perhaps most hauntingly of all, no one knew why. There were no microscopes, no germ theory, no real medicine. People turned to the only explanations they had: divine punishment, demonic possession, the alignment of planets. Emperor Justinian himself, the most powerful man in the Christian world, fell ill. For weeks he hovered near death, and while he survived, his empire did not, at least not in the same way. The plague struck with such speed and cruelty that society couldn't keep up. Gravediggers died faster than they could dig. Clergy gave last rites by the dozen. Families left their loved ones to die alone. Some estimates suggest up to 10,000 people per day died in Constantinople at the height of the outbreak. So many died, in fact, that bodies were tossed into the sea or stacked in towers like firewood. But this wasn't just a health crisis. It was economic collapse. It was spiritual panic. It was the unraveling of a world that believed itself chosen by God and suddenly felt utterly abandoned. As the death toll mounted in Constantinople, the very machinery of the Eastern Roman Empire began to seize up, not from rebellion or invasion, but from the simple, brutal fact that too many people were dying too quickly. Justinian, who had ruled with ambition and iron will, had been in the middle of a sweeping campaign to rebuild the Roman Empire in the West. His armies had reconquered parts of North Africa and Italy. His building projects transformed the skyline, most famously the Hagia Sophia, a cathedral meant to proclaim the glory of God and the might of the emperor. But plague respects no monuments. The logistics of empire, taxes, laws, soldiers, food, collapsed under the weight of the dead. Grain shipments were interrupted, ports shut down, peasant fields were left untilled, armies deserted or died in their camps. And Justinian, despite recovering from his own illness, could no longer command the world as he had before. He tried, oh how he tried. He ordered bodies to be buried in mass graves outside the city walls. He raised taxes, desperate to keep the empire afloat, but who was left to pay? He reorganized administrators, but they too were dying. His famously detailed law codes, meant to bring Roman justice to the world, fell into disuse in plague-ravaged regions where even local scribes had perished. What had once seemed eternal, Rome's eastern twin, the Christian stronghold of Byzantium, now seemed breakable, vulnerable, human, and the consequences were not temporary. Historians estimate that the plague killed between 25 to 50 million people across the Mediterranean world in just a few years, perhaps half the population of the Eastern Roman Empire. Some regions took over a century to recover, if they ever did. The western territories Justinian had fought so hard to reclaim, lost again to the chaos. Italy, especially, plunged into poverty and political fragmentation that would last for centuries. But more haunting than the statistics were the psychological wounds left behind. A once confident civilization, one that had survived barbarian invasions, earthquakes, and fires, had finally met a threat it could not outthink, outbuild, or outfight. People began to question everything. Was God punishing them? Had the end times begun? What if civilization itself, with its cities, trade, and ambition, was the cause of this divine wrath? Thus began a subtle but powerful shift in the medieval mind, away from classical ideals and imperial grandeur, and toward fear, superstition, and retreat from worldly pride. The plague hadn't just killed people, it had killed belief. And that might have been its darkest legacy. The Justinianic plague did not erupt suddenly in Constantinople like a divine bolt from the sky. It crept in silent, hidden, and relentless, following the same veins of prosperity and empire that had made Byzantium so powerful in the first place. To trace its origins, we must begin in the steppes and deserts of Central Asia, a region that, even in the 6th century, was a crossroads of empire, trade, and migration. Here, the Yersinia pestis bacterium, the true killer, lived quietly inside the guts of fleas. These fleas, in turn, rode on the backs of black rats, who followed grain, humans, and warmth like shadows stalking civilization itself. Historians and paleogeneticists believe the bacterium traveled along the Silk Road, hitching rides on merchant caravans that crisscrossed the vast distance between Asia and the heart of the Mediterranean. These were not primitive paths. They were thriving arteries of commerce, culture, and conquest, but in this case, they also became highways of horror. One critical link was Egypt, particularly its bustling port cities that connected Africa and the Mediterranean with goods and disease. Egypt was the breadbasket of the empire, supplying Constantinople with enormous shipments of grain, carried across the sea in vast fleets of wheat ships. But these ships carried more than food. In their dark, damp holds, rats nested, bred, and multiplied, infested with fleas who had already tasted plague-tainted blood. Somewhere along this route, perhaps in Pelusium, on Egypt's northern coast, the first outbreaks of plague began. From there, the disease followed the very structure of empire, up the Nile, across to Alexandria, and then out to sea toward Constantinople, the imperial capital, where the Emperor Justinian himself sat enthroned in gold. And here's the brutal irony. The very wealth and organization that made the Eastern Roman Empire so strong also made it vulnerable. Grain imports were crucial to keeping Constantinople alive. They fed hundreds of thousands of citizens, soldiers, monks, scribes, artisans, and nobles. But those grain ships, laden with tainted rats, became the Trojan horses of pestilence. When the plague finally entered the city in 541 CE, it didn't strike suddenly like fire or earthquake. It took days, then weeks, then months, but once it began, it moved with stunning speed. The disease didn't care about class or creed. Beggars died in the alleys, senators in their villas, monks in their monasteries, and generals in their armor. And yet, even as the city burned with fever and fear, few understood what they were facing. The very idea of a contagious disease carried by rats and fleas was unthinkable in the worldview of the time. People searched for omens, for divine punishment, for cosmic meaning, not for rodents under their floorboards. In this tragic ignorance, the machinery of empire kept turning, still receiving shipments of grain, still welcoming ships into the harbors, even as death climbed silently ashore with every load of wheat. The invisible invader had arrived. And Constantinople would never be the same. When the Justinianic plague finally breached the majestic walls of Constantinople, it did not come like a conqueror with banners and war horns. It arrived like rot, quiet, seeping, and irreversible. It entered through the ports, through the food, through the rats scuttling beneath mosaic floors, and by the time the city truly noticed, it was already dying. Contemporary accounts describe a horror so overwhelming, so total, that it silenced even the most seasoned observers. The historian Procopius, usually so sharp and unforgiving in his criticism of the emperor, sounds almost stunned in his account. They died in heaps, so the dead were too many to bury, and the living too few to mourn. Daily life ground to a halt, markets closed, courts stopped, bells no longer rang from churches. The public baths, once the pride of Roman civilization, stood empty, echoing. Even the Byzantine bureaucracy, famous for its obsession with order and record-keeping, could no longer function. The scribes fell ill, the clerks fled. Orders went unanswered, justice was suspended, the death toll was catastrophic. At its peak, the plague was said to kill up to 10,000 people a day in Constantinople alone. While some modern historians are skeptical of this number, even conservative estimates suggest that at least a third, perhaps half, of the city's population perished. Bodies were everywhere. Carts rolled through the city streets, not selling bread or wine but collecting corpses, dumped hastily into mass graves or in desperation, thrown into the sea. The stench was unimaginable. The air itself seemed cursed. Many people stopped praying, stopped hoping. Some believed it was the end of the world. Even Emperor Justinian himself contracted the disease. He hovered on the edge of death for weeks, shrouded in fever and pain. Though he ultimately survived, one of the few in power who did, his brush with death would mark a turning point in his rule. He returned from the edge changed, paranoid, isolated, increasingly ruthless in his decrees. The empire, already bleeding, would begin to harden and crack under the weight of fear. The military campaigns Justinian had waged to reclaim the western provinces, North Africa, Italy, stalled. Resources once poured into conquest were now diverted into survival. Troops died, supplies vanished. The once grand dream of a reunited Roman Empire began to dim, not because of a rival army, but because of a microbe too small to see. The economic collapse was swift and brutal. With so many dead, entire industries vanished. Farmland lay untended, grain imports halted, tax revenue collapsed, and with it, the infrastructure of empire. Bridges weren't repaired. Roads weren't patrolled, banditry increased, trade withered. Famine soon followed disease, as often happens, and in some parts of the empire, entire towns were simply abandoned. But perhaps the most terrifying impact of the plague was psychological. It shattered the illusion of divine protection. The Christian world believed itself chosen, guarded by saints, by relics, by holy emperors ordained by God. Yet no relic, no procession, no prayer could stop the rats. And in that spiritual collapse, a new kind of medieval fear was born, one that would echo through centuries. The belief that death was everywhere and that perhaps God no longer watched. This was not merely a health crisis. This was a spiritual, political, and civilizational collapse. And it set the stage for the darker centuries to come, centuries shaped by trauma, suspicion, and the shadow of a world that had once dared to feel immortal. It is one of the most haunting questions in medieval history. How could something so devastating, so immense in its toll, simply disappear from collective memory? The Justinianic plague, after all, was not a footnote. It shattered an empire, killed tens of millions, and reshaped the trajectory of Europe and the Mediterranean. And yet, unlike the Black Death, it left behind no nursery rhymes, no moral fables, no wide cultural echoes. It is, to most people, unknown. Why? Part of the answer lies in how memory is preserved and who does the preserving. The Black Death of the 14th century occurred in a world saturated with paper, monastic record-keeping, parish logs, and university chronicles. The 6th century, by contrast, was poised on the edge of antiquity and medieval darkness. Literacy had declined, printing didn't exist. Record-keeping was limited to imperial scribes and religious elites, many of whom died in the plague themselves. The voices that could have told the story were silenced by the very thing they tried to describe. Moreover, the survivors didn't want to remember. The trauma was overwhelming. Entire families had perished. Cities became tombs. For many, forgetting became a coping mechanism, a survival strategy. Unlike the romanticized martyrdom of saints or the glorified memories of battles, there was nothing redemptive about the plague. It was suffering without meaning. Then there was the issue of spiritual interpretation. In a deeply Christian society, events were filtered through theological lenses. If a disaster struck, people sought sin, judgment, or divine punishment. But what if the suffering seemed arbitrary? What if the righteous died alongside the wicked, without pattern, without justice? The plague disrupted the very moral order of the universe, and when that happened, silence often followed. Historians, too, overlooked the event for centuries. The plague was briefly mentioned by writers like Procopius, John of Ephesus, and Evagrius Scholasticus, but their accounts were fragmentary, even skeptical. Later chroniclers who focused on wars, emperors, and church councils often skipped it. And because the death was invisible, no dramatic battles, no burning cities, it became inconvenient to the grand narrative of empire and faith. It wasn't until the 20th century, with the rise of modern epidemiology and archaeology, that the scale of the Justinianic plague began to resurface. DNA testing of ancient graves, pollen analysis of abandoned fields. Isotope studies, these scientific tools unearthed what the written word had buried, a catastrophe to rival the Black Death, lost to time by accident and design. In the end, the Justinianic plague didn't just destroy lives, it erased itself. It killed the storytellers, it left behind no myth, no symbol, no cultural scar strong enough to endure. It was a scream in the archives that no one heard for 1,500 years. And perhaps that is the greatest tragedy of all. For centuries, the Justinianic plague lingered in the background of historical inquiry, mentioned, doubted, then dismissed. Some scholars even argued that the sources were exaggerated. After all, how could something so devastating leave so few traces? And then came science, not legend, not hearsay, genetics, isotopes, bones, dirt, teeth. It began with mass graves. Archaeologists digging near Aschheim, a town in modern-day Germany, stumbled upon a burial pit filled with bodies dated to the 6th century. Many were interred hastily, their positioning awkward, as though death had come too quickly to allow for ceremony. Initially assumed to be war victims, a closer inspection told a different story. Some skeletons had signs of stress, but no weapons, no trauma, no battle, just death, sudden, widespread. Researchers began testing dental pulp, a place where blood-borne pathogens can remain sealed for millennia. And then the discovery, Yersinia pestis. The same bacterium responsible for the Black Death, the DNA evidence was unequivocal. The Justinianic plague was real, and it was caused by the same killer that ravaged Europe 800 years later, and it wasn't just in Germany. Evidence emerged in southern France, Austria, Spain, and even Britain. Entire cemeteries tested positive. In some cases, children made up the majority of the victims, suggesting a population weakened by hunger, climate, or poverty. But what shocked scientists wasn't just the reach, it was the speed. The plague moved faster than medieval armies, faster than Roman road messengers. It spread along trade routes, shipping lanes, and even river systems. From Egypt to Constantinople, from Rome to the Alps, no settlement was too remote. And it was relentless. Historical data and modeling show that the plague didn't strike once. It came in successive waves, returning every few decades. Some researchers estimate over 15 major resurgences between 541 and 750. Each wave battered a civilization already gasping for breath, but science didn't stop at identifying the bacterium. It began reconstructing the climate conditions of the era. Using ice cores from Greenland, scientists discovered volcanic eruptions in 536 and 540, massive ones that cooled the earth, reduced crop yields, and triggered widespread famine. This weakened immune systems made communities desperate and gave Yersinia pestis the perfect host environment. Combined with urban crowding, lack of sanitation, and poor medical understanding, the result was predictable. A pandemic on a scale the ancient world had never seen. This new research has rewritten history books. Once dismissed as medieval rumor, the Justinianic plague is now seen as the first recorded global pandemic, a trial run in many ways for the Black Death to come. And the scariest part, modern Yersinia pestis isn't extinct. It still exists today, quietly circulating in rodent populations across Asia, Africa, and even the southwestern United States. Humanity only stays ahead of it thanks to antibiotics, sanitation, and global surveillance. But the science of the Justinianic plague reminds us, what is forgotten is not always gone. When the Justinianic plague swept through the Byzantine Empire, it didn't just decimate populations. It reshaped the trajectory of an entire continent, and the changes it triggered still echo today, though they're rarely credited to the outbreak. The most immediate consequence was demographic collapse. Some regions lost 30 to 60% of their population. In cities like Constantinople, entire districts became silent. Farmlands were abandoned, markets dried up. Roads that once bustled with merchants and pilgrims now stood empty. The economy, once a powerful Roman machine, sputtered. and with the economy, so too faltered the bureaucracy. The Byzantine Empire was a sophisticated state, built on taxes, grain shipments, and military logistics. But a plague that killed taxpayers, farmers, and soldiers alike crippled the empire's ability to govern. The state had to redirect funds just to bury the dead, to stop looting, to restore order, but the damage went deeper. Without a stable workforce, agriculture collapsed in many regions, trade networks shriveled, coinage became scarce. The gold solidus, once the symbol of Roman economic might, began to vanish from circulation. Instead, bartering returned. People started to think and live locally again. This decentralization had profound consequences. In a world where the central government was weak and the infrastructure neglected, power began to localize. Landowners, bishops, and warlords, people with resources, began to assume control over villages and districts. They offered protection, food, and justice in return for loyalty. Sound familiar? That was the birth of feudalism. The very system we now associate with the Middle Ages, lords, vassals, serfs, took root in this vacuum left behind by the plague. It wasn't just barbarian invasions or Roman decline that ended antiquity. It was this slow, grinding transformation after the plague's destruction. People didn't return to cities, they built manors. They didn't trust emperors. They relied on local knights, even religion shifted. The plague had shaken faith to the core. Traditional pagan temples had vanished centuries before, but now Christianity transformed. From a message of triumph and salvation, it became deeply intertwined with fear, penance, and the wrath of God. Monasteries grew in importance, not just spiritually, but economically and politically. They filled the void of state institutions. In the West, the vacuum allowed for the rise of a new power entirely, the Carolingians, and eventually the birth of the Holy Roman Empire. All of this feudalism, fractured power, agrarian stagnation would define Europe for centuries, and it all traces in part to a bacterium invisible to the eye that struck without warning. The Justinianic plague didn't just end lives, it ended a world, and in its place the medieval era rose, not in fire and conquest, but in fear, famine, and survival. For a pandemic that may have killed over 100 million people across centuries, the Justinianic plague is strangely absent from the cultural consciousness. Unlike the Black Death, which left vivid scars in art, literature, and folklore, the Justinianic plague became a whisper, barely mentioned in school books, rarely dramatized, and often dismissed as a footnote in Roman history. But why? The answer lies partly in timing. The Black Death exploded into a Europe that was already documenting its world. There were chroniclers, poets, merchants, and monks who wrote with grim detail about the suffering around them. Their words echoed across generations. But in the 6th and 7th centuries, the world was going dark, literacy was declining, scrolls were lost, scribes were few. Many who witnessed the plague firsthand died without leaving a trace. And even when records were made, they often weren't preserved. Fires, wars, and decay erased them. This was a time when civilizations forgot how to remember. There's also the question of identity. The Justinianic plague occurred during a moment when the Western Roman Empire had already collapsed, and the Eastern Empire, centered in Constantinople, was beginning to look less Roman and more Byzantine. Later European chroniclers didn't see this era as theirs. They viewed it as a distant, almost alien past. As Europe moved into the High Middle Ages and then the Renaissance, scholars looked to classical Rome or the devastation of the Black Death, not the chaotic, crumbling bridge in between. In that gap, the plague was buried. Religion also played a role. The Black Death was folded into Christian theology. Seen as a punishment from God, it gave rise to art filled with skeletons, demons, and sinners. But the Justinianic plague happened before that rich symbolic tradition took hold. Without the cultural infrastructure to turn death into metaphor, the story simply disappeared into silence. And perhaps most ironically, modern historians also overlooked it for centuries. Why? Because for a long time, scholars didn't believe it was a true pandemic. They dismissed Procopius's dramatic accounts as exaggeration. Without archaeological evidence, it was thought to be a myth, but in the last 2 decades that has changed. Burials have been uncovered. DNA of Yersinia pestis, the plague bacterium, has been extracted from 6th century teeth. Suddenly, the whispers of ancient texts have been confirmed by modern science. We now know this plague was real, it was vast, it was deadly. And it was forgotten not because it was small, but because the world it ravaged never recovered enough to remember. The silence wasn't proof of survival, it was proof of collapse. Though it's been over 1,400 years since the first wave of the Justinianic plague swept through Constantinople, its legacy still pulses through the veins of our modern world, like a ghost virus encoded in the very structure of civilization. Let's begin with the most immediate effect, demographic collapse. The plague didn't just kill millions, it shattered population growth in Europe and the Near East for centuries. With each recurrence, the empire's tax base, military recruitment, and agricultural production fell apart. Cities shrank, trade networks decayed, and in the West, the fragile remnants of Roman civilization quietly disintegrated into what we now call the Dark Ages. The political ripple effect was profound. Justinian had dreams of restoring the full Roman Empire, of reunifying East and West, but after the plague, those dreams died with the infected. His empire could no longer afford the soldiers or the infrastructure to maintain those conquests. In this way, a bacterium may have halted the revival of Rome, shaping the map of Europe permanently, but the echoes don't stop there. The plague played a critical role in the rise of feudalism. As population centers thinned, labor became scarce, and local power structures rose to fill the void. Lords took control, serfs were bound to the land. In short, the medieval order, which would define Europe for nearly 1,000 years, was built on the bones of Justinian's dead. Even language and law bear its mark. Latin, the administrative language of the Roman Empire, began its long fragmentation as central authority faded. Legal structures decentralized, and the once unified Mediterranean world fractured into dozens of linguistic and cultural islands, each isolated by fear and death. And now, in the 21st century, we're rediscovering what the medieval world forgot. The rise of genetic archaeology, extracting ancient DNA from skeletons, has confirmed the presence of Yersinia pestis in plague pits across Europe and Asia. We now know the Justinianic plague wasn't legend. It was a real, deadly pandemic, one that predated and arguably enabled the devastation of the Black Death centuries later. But the most haunting echo may be psychological. Because in the age of COVID-19 and global pandemics, the story of Justinian's plague forces us to ask, what happens when we forget? What wisdom did we lose in the collapse? What human stories disappeared because no one survived to tell them? The tragedy of the Justinianic plague isn't just in the bodies it buried, it's in the silence it left behind. And perhaps by remembering it now, we reclaim something more than history. We reclaim the voices of the forgotten. We draw a fragile line of continuity across centuries of shadow. And we remind ourselves that even in collapse there is learning, that in every forgotten city, every lost scroll, and every tooth bearing the plague's DNA, there's still a story, waiting to be unearthed, waiting to be